What if the history you learned in school wasn't true? From noble explorers and brave emperors to glorious wars and righteous revolutions, many of the facts we memorized were carefully crafted myths. Today, we uncover 21 historical lies that shaped how we see the world and why we still believe them. Across the world, classrooms are where national memory is forged. Students sit in rows, open textbooks, and absorb stories presented as facts. But those stories are rarely neutral. They are shaped by the needs of the present, not always the truths of the past. Much of what is taught as history is, in reality, selective narrative. Not because teachers intend to deceive, but because educational systems are built to simplify, to inspire, and often to protect. Complex realities are reduced to digestible summaries. Moral ambiguity is replaced with clear heroes and villains. Events that cast a nation in a negative light are minimized, omitted, or reframed to appear noble. This isn't a modern problem. It's a pattern as old as education itself. In 19th century Europe, history became a tool for building national identity. After wars, revolutions, and colonization, governments realized that controlling the past could shape loyalty in the future. Textbooks were edited to glorify founding fathers, erase indigenous voices, and justify conquest. In the United States, the lost cause narrative dominated Southern textbooks for decades, portraying the Confederacy as noble and slavery as benign. In Japan, several history texts downplay the atrocities committed during the Second Sino-Japanese War, including the Nanjing Massacre. In Turkey, the Armenian genocide is rarely acknowledged in official curricula. These are not accidents. They are deliberate omissions designed to maintain political narratives and avoid collective guilt. Even global events like World War II are framed differently depending on geography. In the West, the American and British efforts are emphasized. In Russia, the focus is on the Soviet Union's devastating sacrifices. Both are true, but each tells only part of the story. Modern historians and educators increasingly recognize these distortions. Historical scholarship now demands primary sources, diverse perspectives, and critical analysis. But the gap between academic history and what's taught in schools remains wide, especially where political interests interfere with curriculum. What students often receive is not history, but mythology, and these myths shape how generations view their nation, their identity, and the world beyond. The question isn't just what happened, it's who gets to decide what's remembered. This documentary challenges 21 widely taught historical claims. Not to tear down the past, but to understand how it was built, and to ask what else might lie beneath the surface of what we were told. For generations, school children have been taught that history's great explorers discovered new lands, blazing trails into the unknown and expanding the boundaries of civilization. But the truth is more complex and often far more troubling. The most enduring of these myths surrounds Christopher Columbus. In 1492, he sailed westward from Spain and landed in what is now the Bahamas. Schoolbooks often declare that Columbus discovered America. But this phrase ignores the millions of indigenous people who had lived across the Americas for thousands of years. Advanced civilizations like the Maya, the Aztec, and the Inca had built cities, engineered agriculture, and developed writing systems long before Columbus arrived. Even from a European perspective, Columbus wasn't the first. Leif Erikson, a Norse explorer, reached the coast of what is now Newfoundland around the year 1000, nearly 5 centuries earlier. Columbus never set foot on the mainland of North America, yet his name became synonymous with discovery, while indigenous histories were erased. Another persistent myth is that Columbus proved the world was round. In fact, ancient scholars had known this for centuries. Eratosthenes of Cyrene, a Greek mathematician in the 3rd century BCE, not only understood that the Earth was spherical, he calculated its circumference with surprising accuracy using shadows and geometry. Educated Europeans in the 15th century weren't debating the shape of the Earth, they were debating the size of the oceans. The flat Earth myth was later amplified by 19th century writers, not Columbus's contemporaries. Further east, Captain James Cook is often credited in textbooks with the discovery of Australia in 1770. Yet, long before Cook's ship Endeavour reached the continent's eastern shores, Aboriginal Australians had lived there for over 50,000 years. Their cultures, languages, and systems of law were complex and deeply connected to the land. Cook mapped the eastern coast and claimed it for Britain, despite the presence of established populations. Western narratives transformed this into a story of discovery, one that ignored the dispossession that followed. These myths were not born by accident. They were crafted to serve a purpose, to legitimize colonialism, to justify conquest, and to present European expansion as a heroic chapter in global history. By declaring lands as discovered, colonial powers erased the legitimacy of the people already living there. Their histories were deemed irrelevant, their civilizations labeled primitive or invisible. Modern historians have worked to correct these myths, uncovering archaeological evidence, indigenous oral traditions, and cross-cultural accounts that were long dismissed or ignored. But the legacy of these lies remains. Statues still stand, holidays still mark the wrong names. And in many classrooms, the simplified version of history continues to shape young minds. Discovery in these contexts is not about finding something new. It is about claiming something, regardless of who was already there. Empires are often remembered through the lens of power, progress, and glory. But beneath their monuments and maps lies a foundation of myths, crafted to justify dominance and conceal darker truths. One of the most persistent lies surrounds the British Empire's role in ending slavery. In many school systems, the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act is taught as proof of Britain's moral leadership. What's rarely emphasized is that for over 2 centuries prior, the British were among the largest traffickers in the transatlantic slave trade, transporting an estimated 3.1 million Africans into slavery. When the empire finally abolished slavery, it compensated slave owners, not the enslaved. The British government paid the equivalent of billions in today's currency to preserve the economic stability of former slaveholders. That debt, remarkably, was still being paid off by British taxpayers until 2015. The narrative of abolition, stripped of this context, reframes moral responsibility while minimizing systemic exploitation. Another commonly taught misconception is that the Roman Empire collapsed in a single dramatic event, marking the end of classical civilization. In reality, the fall of Rome was a slow, multi-generational decline. The city of Rome was sacked in 410 CE by the Visigoths and again in 455 CE by the Vandals. But the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to flourish for nearly 1,000 more years, with its capital in Constantinople enduring until 1453. The myth of a single collapse simplifies the complex interplay of economic strain, military overreach, and internal decay, reducing centuries of history into a single dramatic fall. Then there's the global belief that the Great Wall of China is visible from space with the naked eye. This claim, repeated in schoolbooks and pop culture, has been thoroughly debunked. The wall, though immense, is narrow and built with materials that blend into the natural landscape. Astronauts from multiple space agencies, including NASA, have confirmed that the wall is not visible to the unaided eye from low Earth orbit. The origin of this myth is unclear, but it gained traction in the 20th century and became symbolic of China's ancient engineering prowess, even if physically inaccurate. These deceptions are not trivial. They shape how empires are remembered, not as systems of domination, but as civilizing forces. By rewriting their own pasts, empires reinforce the belief that power was earned, not imposed, that wealth was deserved, not extracted. Unlearning these myths is essential to understanding how history has been used, not just to explain the past, but to control the future. Historical figures are often taught as symbols, brave, noble, and morally unshakable. But beneath the surface of schoolbook portraits lie distortions, half-truths, myths, and deliberate rewrites that shaped how nations view their greatest names. Napoleon Bonaparte is one of the most misrepresented figures in world history. In countless school lessons and caricatures, he is described as abnormally short, a man overcompensating for his height with ambition and conquest. But Napoleon wasn't short for his time. He measured around 5 feet 7 inches in modern terms, average for a Frenchman in the late 18th century. The myth of his short stature originated partly from a misunderstanding. French inches were longer than British inches, leading British newspapers to label him little. The British press weaponized the image during the Napoleonic Wars, depicting him as a stunted megalomaniac. The lie endured long after the propaganda had served its purpose. Another figure tangled in myth is Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France before the Revolution. She is often remembered for one phrase, "Let them eat cake." It was supposedly her cold response when told that the peasants had no bread. But historians agree that there is no evidence she ever said it. The phrase appeared in literature before her time, notably in Rousseau's Confessions, written when Marie was just a child. It was later attributed to her during the Revolution as a symbol of royal indifference and decadence. In reality, Marie Antoinette was far from politically enlightened, but she was also not the monster history painted her to be. The quote was a tool and one that helped stoke revolutionary anger. Even figures celebrated for moral clarity are often simplified. Abraham Lincoln is rightly remembered as the president who issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, declaring enslaved people in Confederate states free. But what's often omitted is that this proclamation did not apply to slaveholding Union states like Kentucky or Maryland. It was a wartime measure, intended to weaken the Confederacy and shift the war's moral framework. Lincoln's personal views on race evolved over time. Early in his career, he supported the colonization of freed Black Americans outside the U.S. His legacy as the Great Emancipator is real, but it emerged from political complexity, not pure moral clarity. These historical icons were not caricatures, they were complicated individuals shaped by their time. But school systems have often chosen simplicity over nuance. By flattening their stories, societies make them easier to idolize and or condemn. Historical myth-making does more than distort the past, it shapes the present. When we learn only the sanitized version of leadership, we lose the ability to confront the hard truths that define real progress. That leaders are flawed, their decisions imperfect, and their legacies contested. Understanding the difference between the myth and the man, or woman, isn't about tearing down history. It's about reclaiming it. Every war leaves behind destruction, grief, and stories. But the stories that survive are often not those told by the defeated, the civilians, or the neutral observers. They are shaped by those who win. And in the hands of the victors, war becomes a stage for myth-making. In the Western world, one of the most enduring historical distortions is that the United States won World War II almost single-handedly. American involvement was undeniably decisive, especially in the Pacific Theater and in financing the Allied war machine. But the war's European outcome was heavily shaped by the Soviet Union, which bore the brunt of Nazi aggression. Between 1941 and 1945, the USSR lost an estimated 27 million people, military and civilian, more than all other Allied nations combined. It was on the Eastern Front, not in Normandy, where Germany's army suffered its greatest defeats. Battles like Stalingrad and Kursk turned the tide of the war. Yet for decades, Cold War tensions suppressed recognition of the Soviet contribution in many Western school systems. The narrative emphasized D-Day and the liberation of Western Europe, downplaying the full scope of global collaboration and sacrifice. Another war story dismissed as legend until recently is that of the Trojan War. For centuries it was taught as a myth, the tale of Helen, Paris, Achilles, and a wooden horse, drawn from Homer's Iliad. But in the late 19th century, German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann excavated ruins at Hisarlik, in modern-day Turkey, which correspond to ancient Troy. Later excavations revealed evidence of violent destruction and warfare dating to around 1200 BCE, the same period Homer's epics are believed to reference. While the gods and heroes remain literary invention, the conflict itself may well have been based on a real siege, possibly one of many that occurred during the collapse of Bronze Age civilizations. Finally, consider the American Revolution. Taught in many classrooms as a pure battle for liberty against tyranny, the reality was more nuanced. While taxation without representation was a rallying cry, economic interests, land expansion, and political power were major motivations behind the push for independence. The Founding Fathers, including slaveholders, spoke of universal liberty while denying rights to women, Native Americans, and enslaved Africans. British proposals to offer freedom to slaves who joined their ranks were viewed by some colonists as a greater threat than taxation itself. When war becomes story, the gray areas fade. victors simplify, defeated voices are lost, and textbooks follow suit, turning violence and complexity into digestible, patriotic narratives. Real history is rarely that clean. To understand it, we must listen to more than just the side that won. Some of the most enduring lies in history are the ones we don't learn from textbooks, but from paintings, novels, films, and symbols. These cultural myths shape how we imagine the past. They become so familiar, so visual, that we rarely question whether they're true. Consider the myth that the Great Pyramids of Giza were built by slaves. For decades, this narrative was reinforced in Hollywood films and Western literature, but archaeological evidence tells a different story. Excavations in the 1990s near the pyramids uncovered workers' villages with evidence of decent food, medical care, and dignified burial practices. The workers were not enslaved, and they were likely skilled laborers, conscripted or employed in national service. The idea of mass slave labor likely emerged from Greek historians like Herodotus and was later reinforced by popular culture, but it lacks support from primary Egyptian sources. This myth diminished the architectural genius of ancient Egypt, reducing it to brute force rather than state-level organization and planning. Another common image taught and widely believed is that Vikings wore horned helmets. There is no archaeological evidence to support this. No Viking helmet with horns has ever been found. The image first gained popularity in the 19th century, especially in opera costumes, romantic art, and nationalist propaganda. It offered a visual shorthand for savagery and barbarism, contrasting the civilized Christian Europe of the time. The real Vikings were seafarers, merchants, and warriors, but not horned devils. The myth stuck because it was theatrical. Then there's the tale of Salem's witches burned at the stake, a dramatic, horrifying image repeated in popular accounts and fiction. But during the 1692 Salem witch trials in Massachusetts, none of the accused were burned. 19 people were hanged, and one man was pressed to death with heavy stones. Burning was never part of the legal system in colonial New England. That punishment was more common in European witch hunts, especially in parts of Germany and Scotland. The confusion stems from blending different cultural histories into a single, emotionally powerful narrative. These myths persist because they're easy to visualize. A pyramid swarmed by slaves, a Viking in a horned helmet, a witch tied to a stake. They've been repeated so often in films, TV, and novels that they've become fixed in the public imagination. But they're not rooted in evidence. Correcting these myths isn't about spoiling stories. It's about giving credit where it's due, to real people in real contexts whose histories deserve truth, not fantasy. Every generation looks back to a time it considers a peak, an era of light emerging from darkness. But so-called golden ages are often romanticized, simplified, and sanitized versions of a more complex, sometimes uncomfortable reality. Begin with the Middle Ages, often referred to in school books and media as the Dark Ages, a time supposedly marked by ignorance, superstition, and cultural stagnation. But this characterization is misleading. While Western Europe faced political fragmentation and occasional decline after the fall of Rome, the period was far from intellectually dead. Monasteries preserved classical texts, universities began to emerge, and technological innovations such as the heavy plow, windmills, and mechanical clocks advanced medieval society. Major philosophical, architectural, and legal developments took place, especially during the High Middle Ages. The idea of a dark, backward Europe came later, largely from Renaissance thinkers who wanted to distinguish themselves from the past, and later from Enlightenment writers promoting a narrative of linear progress. That leads to the second myth, that the Renaissance was a sudden rediscovery of knowledge lost for 1,000 years. While the Renaissance certainly produced extraordinary art, science, and humanist thought, it did not emerge from a complete void. Much of the classical knowledge that fueled the Renaissance had been preserved and expanded by Islamic scholars in centers like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo. Thinkers like Avicenna, Al-Khwarizmi, and Averroes translated and built upon Greek texts, creating advancements in medicine, astronomy, and mathematics that later made their way back into Europe. The so-called rediscovery was not simply a European triumph, but a product of cross-cultural transmission, one rarely emphasized in traditional Western education. Lastly, consider ancient Athens, often celebrated as the birthplace of democracy. The Athenian system is held up as an early model of citizen participation and equality. But this democracy excluded women, slaves, and foreigners, the majority of the population. Only adult male citizens, roughly 10 to 15% of the population, had voting rights. Athens also maintained a large enslaved workforce and engaged in imperial conquest across the Aegean. Its democratic ideals were radical for their time, but incomplete by modern standards. These golden ages serve a purpose. They create narratives of progress, superiority, and identity. But when stripped of their complexities, they become misleading. They obscure the contributions of other civilizations, hide inequalities, and flatten nuance into myth. History becomes more valuable, not less, when we confront these truths. The past wasn't golden, it was human. National identity is often built not on facts, but on carefully selected memories. In classrooms across the world, children are taught simplified, patriotic narratives, stories that inspire pride, unity, and belonging. But behind these narratives lie distortions, omissions, and outright fabrications. Take the idea that America's founding fathers believed in universal equality. The Declaration of Independence, authored in 1776, famously declares that all men are created equal. Yet the society that produced those words was deeply unequal. Of the 56 signers of the Declaration, at least 41 were slave owners. Enslaved people, Native Americans, and women were excluded from the freedoms being proclaimed. Even the U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1788, counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for legislative representation, a political compromise that protected slavery while claiming moral high ground. The myth of the founders as pure champions of liberty remains central to American identity, even though their actions reveal deep contradictions. Another enduring falsehood surrounds Thanksgiving, often taught as a peaceful feast between Pilgrims and Native Americans in 1621. While a harvest meal did occur, the broader context is darker. The arrival of Europeans brought waves of disease, displacement, and violence that decimated native populations. By the time the Pilgrims arrived, up to 90% of the local Wampanoag population had already been killed by plague introduced by earlier explorers. The peace that followed the meal was short-lived. Within decades, colonial expansion led to bloody conflicts like King Philip's War, one of the deadliest in American history. The sanitized version of Thanksgiving erases these realities and presents colonialism as harmonious cultural exchange. Perhaps the most pervasive lie of all is that history is objective. Textbooks often portray themselves as neutral, authoritative sources. But history is always told from a perspective. What gets included and what is left out depends on who is in power. In Turkey, public education avoids acknowledging the Armenian genocide. In Japan, some textbooks minimize the atrocities of the Second Sino-Japanese War. In Russia, Stalin's purges are sometimes softened in school curricula. These aren't just historical debates, they are battles over national identity. When history becomes mythology, it stops being a tool for understanding and becomes a weapon for control. It tells citizens what to be proud of and what to forget. Uncovering these lies isn't about erasing identity, it's about grounding it in truth. Once a myth becomes part of national memory, it's difficult to dislodge. Even when exposed, false narratives can persist for generations, not just because they were taught, but because they were internalized. Unlearning these narratives isn't just a matter of correcting the record. It requires confronting what those beliefs meant to us and what they continue to justify. Historical lies are rarely innocent. They often serve a purpose to validate authority, to inspire loyalty, or to justify injustice. For example, the sanitized stories of colonialism, filled with noble explorers and benevolent empires, concealed the reality of exploitation, violence, and cultural erasure. The cost of those myths wasn't just academic. It shaped policies, suppressed voices, and wrote entire populations out of their own histories. In the United States, the belief that the Civil War was fought purely over states' rights, rather than slavery, allowed generations to ignore the structural racism that persisted long after abolition. In post-colonial nations, clinging to distorted versions of liberation movements has sometimes obscured uncomfortable truths about internal divisions, power struggles, and authoritarianism. False histories also breed false pride, a kind that resists accountability. When national identity is built on myth, questioning it feels like betrayal. Textbooks become battlegrounds. Curriculum debates become ideological wars. This isn't limited to one region. In India, Turkey, Brazil, Poland, Russia, and elsewhere, historical revisionism has become a political tool, shaping education to fit the present government's agenda. For individuals, the process of unlearning can be emotional. It means questioning what was once trusted. It means acknowledging harm, even when no guilt was intended. And it means accepting that the past is not a neat story with heroes and villains, but a complex record of decisions, consequences, and contradictions. Still, unlearning is necessary, because history isn't just about what happened, it's about who gets to remember it and how. Every lie we leave unchallenged reinforces systems that were built on them. The cost of belief is not just ignorance, it's complicity. Truth, even when uncomfortable, is the only path to clarity. The stories we were told shape the world we live in, but the stories we choose to uncover and understand will shape the world to come. History is not a fixed story. It is a living investigation, revised not because facts change, but because perspectives deepen. For too long, textbooks have offered a version of the past that is simplified, sanitized, and framed to fit national pride. But real history rarely aligns with clean narratives. The truth is more complicated. It is found in the silences, in the voices left out, the evidence ignored, the contradictions buried under slogans and statues. And while textbooks may teach foundational dates and names, they often fail to ask, who wrote this? Who benefits from this version? And who was erased to make it easier to believe? Across the world, historians, archaeologists, and scholars have spent decades challenging the myths of empire, exposing the complexities of revolution, and restoring the agency of indigenous peoples, enslaved populations, and marginalized communities. Their work is not about tearing down history, it is about expanding it. Correcting the record does not weaken a nation. It strengthens its understanding of itself. But these truths rarely make it into classrooms, and at least not easily. Updating school curricula requires political will, institutional support, and a public willing to confront discomfort. In many places, telling the truth is still considered dangerous. Educators who speak honestly about colonialism, slavery, or systemic violence face censorship, backlash, or worse. Still, the pursuit of historical truth continues. In museums, archives, oral traditions, and community memory, more complete stories are being pieced together. Young people today have access to more information than any generation before them. And with that access comes a responsibility, not just to learn history, but to interrogate it. The goal is not to replace one myth with another. It's to understand the past as it truly was, flawed, conflicted, and human. Because only through that understanding can we build societies that are honest about where they've been and conscious of where they're going. History is not sacred. It is not static. It is not a weapon to protect or a shield against guilt. It is a mirror. And the more clearly we see into it, the more clearly we can see ourselves.